Programme for next year is more or less complete, and we will be putting it out fairly shortly. There are some good speakers coming along. The first one, which is on the bottom of that sheet there, is Emily Mayhew for next year, who you remember spoke about wounded in the First World War. Jolly good talk. She's coming along, and she's talking about wounded in Afghanistan, and she's going to be doing a sort of Cox and Box act with Harry Parker, who, as you probably know, lost both his legs in Afghanistan, son of General Nick Parker. Should be a cracking talk. Other people who are coming to speak, we've got one on Chindit operations. We've got Michael Naxton coming to talk about Victoria Crosses and the history of the Victoria Cross. And we have got other people who I think will provide you with an interesting evening. The programme is going to be published fairly shortly, and it'll be out to you. We'll email it to people, or you can pick up a hard copy here. But enough of the future. This evening, we have got one more. Come on in.
Thank you.
How was the traffic?
Terrible.
Was it? I'm glad you said that, because one or two people said we've been in the pub and we're sorry we're late. We've got Stuart Wheeler, who is the archivist at Bovington with the Royal Tank Museum, coming to talk to us. He is going to talk to us about the Battle of Amiens, and I think it'll be really fascinating. We couldn't quite get it to be on the right anniversary, but it's as near as damn it. So I hope you enjoy the talk. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you, Veer. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
We may not be able to get the talk on the anniversary, but at the museum, the Tank Museum, on the 8th of August, Amiens Day, we actually had a day devoted to this battle. Okay, you wouldn't have seen much in the news. We tried to get as much as we could in the papers, etc., about this, but we got about 3,500 people who were on holiday down there to see us give talks and recreations of the actual of the battle. So we had tanks going around. We had our Mark IV replica and a Challenger 2, serving Challenger 2 with RTR personnel there, and they married up, and she had the photo opportunities, and we were able to tell people about the Battle of Amiens, because really this is the whole thing with 1918, especially in the summer of 1918 and what they call the 100 days, vanishes largely from the view of the public, the general public. If you looked at the BBC, you wouldn't see much at all. You'll just see the fact that we're going to go to Remembrance Day. The fact that we've won the war and we beat the Germans is really one of the stories that doesn't tend to get told. And I know David Woody, our curator, is really an advocate of this view, putting it across that basically, you know, we've heard all the, you know, we know about the loss, we know about the poets, we know about the sort of Blackadder type programs, but let's just actually, for once, applaud the achievement of the British Army in actually winning a campaign and defeating the Germans. And that's generally the actual Tank Museum's view on this, and so that's where we've been going from. So there are obviously about three different sort of views on this period, so August, September, October into November, and really they come from the technological and tactical level. It was technology and tactics that defeated the Germans. There's the operational argument, which is it was the high tempo of the British really pushing the Germans. They just couldn't cope with this on an operational level. And then there's the third one, which is the one that we tend to debunk now, is the idea that it's just that the British didn't win, the Germans lost. So that one's the one that we tend to sort of say, no, you're actually wrong. So if we move into... There we are. If we move into the actual map of northern France and Belgium, we can see there that we have the German positions. We have Amiens noted there, and you have the basically the British and the French positions with the German positions. What we have from March to July is, especially with the Germans, is Operation Michael. 21st of March 1918, they launched their operation, catch the British especially, catch us by surprise, and really push us back. The problem for the Germans is they run out of momentum. We start solidifying the lines, and what we should see here, there we are, start moving across, pull back, and the French pull back. And so the Germans attack. They're trying, basically, they realise that the Americans had just joined in the war, unrestricted submarine warfare started, and they've got this one chance knockout blow. They've just got their troops coming back from the Russian front, the Eastern Front, because of the deal they've done with the communists in Russia. So they're bringing these men back, and they're thinking, this is our key moment that we can actually get this. But what you get is a series. You get a series of episodes following that, where there's a number of actions from March back into July, where really the British are starting to build up. The Allies are starting to build up their forces for an offensive. And what we get is this place called Amiens. Now, I don't know how many people have been out there to Amiens. It's a key transport hub, vital rail hub, vital transport hub. And what they want to do is basically push the Germans back away from it, move them further away, okay, push them further east. And what happens is that we've basically especially this battle that we're going to talk about in a second, Battle of Amiens, the Australians have actually demonstrated their capabilities. They've also been doing what they call peaceful penetration. They've basically been doing trench raiding and effectively really taking portions of the trench line from the Germans, the front line. The Germans, they're beginning to understand that the Germans' morale's low. They're actually attacking the trenches that the Germans are fairly unprepared in. They're not well looked after, these trenches, and this is coming back. And it really comes to a head at the Battle of Amiens. You get 3 Australian brigades. They're supported by tanks. They've trained for this. The Aussies have had some mixed experiences with tanks, and this time they train with them. They train with the tank units. They go in. It's a limited attack at Amiens, but it's really, really effective, and they take ground. And it shows what you can do with the high morale of the troops, the tactical skills that they've got, and the tanks. And this was really effective, and it really resonates with the British. So, use of infantry and tanks. German forts, as I said, were poorly built, and they had a lack of reserves, weakly manned. This was basically, we were thinking to ourselves, hang on a second, the Germans they're not quite up to it at the moment. So, what you get is, the other thing they're looking at Amiens, and they're realising the ground round there is pretty undamaged. Now, we looked at that at Cambrai and in November 1917, and we liked the ground at Cambrai because, again, that was undamaged. If you're going to run these tanks, you need to be able to run them on good ground, not one that's pitted, not like the Somme pictures where it's actually terrible, or at heap where it's actually bogged down. Tanks aren't going to perform well there. What you need is ground where they can operate on, and that's what you get at Amiens. And so then you get basically Rawlinson. General Rawlinson is aware of the success at Amiens, and he thinks, can we launch an attack at Amiens? So 4th of July is Amiens. He's starting to put this attack together. He's starting to go to Hague. He's starting to discuss it, keeping it to a really small, high level of senior officers, because he's actually coming to them and actually saying, look, we want to attack here, but how big do we want to go? And they start saying, okay, put your plans together. Don't tell everybody yet. We'll start looking at it, and we'll start planning to make this a bigger event. So it starts out, it's a limited operation, and it's not something that's going to win the war. They're looking to take that area to the east of Amiens. So nothing more than that really. Just to move the Germans away from this vital hub. It's not this war-winning moment. It's just that they realise the Germans are a little bit out of kilter in this area, and that they can do what they've done at Hamel. This has given them, the success at Cambrai. So the tankies have actually got a chance. They realise that if we use the tanks effectively on good ground, we can do our job. The infantry realise if we've got good artillery support and tanks, we can do our job. And they realise that the German morale is going downhill. So this is all the reasons why Amiens is seeming like a really good deal. There we are. So what we get is the objectives here. So there's the German positions. So the green line there is the front. Well, it's going to be is the objective line. The blue dotted line is where the Germans would be positioned. You've got Amiens over here, and what they're going to try and do is push on. So you've got von Marwitz. So this is German units. So you've got he's got 14th Corps, 11th Corps, 51st Corps, 5 divisions. So you've got 4 divisions, 6 divisions, 5 divisions. The +1 is the ones that are basically coming in a few days later. Okay. Now the German again, morale has been going downhill. They've got less men in these divisions than they had before, so they're not as good as they used to be. And we got another one, and we got von Houtier again. So he's got 3rd Corps, so this is 18th Army, 9th Corps, 1st Reserve Corps, 26th Corps, 17th or 18th Corps, my eyesight, 1st Bavarian Corps. He's there, so they're in these 2 positions. So he's towards the south of this location here. So you've got them actually in these positions. What they don't have is an awful lot of reserves. We know that. So what we've got is the British, we've got the Australians, and we've got the Canadians. Now they're told very late in the day, we're talking late July, to start moving. Okay, the operation is going to begin on the 8th of August. So this is seriously major amounts of planning that needs to go on. Oh, it's not doing that. Okay, there we are. We've got the Cavalry Corps as well, and we've got a reserve, JHQ reserve. Rawlinson again, chance of 4th Army. So what we're going to see is is 4th Army really being expanded massively. The key thing here as well is the British are to the north, Australians in the centre, and we've got the Canadians to the south. The Canadian and the Australian corps are very, very good. Okay, they've been fighting really well. They've got high morale. They're very good at combined arms warfare, and they're really ready for this fight. So you've got very good troops there. And they've got good commanders. So we've got Monash for the Australians. So you can see. So their job is to advance to the centre. It's very good areas for attacking, and they're familiar with the area. They've got 5 divisions, plus 5th Tank Brigade. Okay. Then we've got Monash, Curry, for the Canadians, and he's got 4 divisions plus 4th Tank Brigade. They're new to the area. They've got marsh and high ground in the southern flank. Okay. But these are their objectives. The first objective is green, second objective red, and third objective is blue. And what we'll see is how far they get on that first day. And this is what's significant there. You can see the sort of distances. The green line there from the start positions is about 3,500 to 4,000 yards. The red line is a further 2,000 to 5,000 yards, and the blue line is 10,000 to 14,000 yards in total. So that's how much they're going to move. They're going to move between 10,000 and 14,000 yards. That is the objectives of this operation. Get that one down again. Yeah. That's all right. Yeah. So defending German forces, we've seen them. What we have: lots of machine guns, lots of artillery. What's going to be happening is they've extended their front line. You know, the failure of the Michael operation in March has exhausted the German army by this time in the summer of 1918. The troops, as we said, divisions are getting smaller. They've suffered 800,000 casualties, especially in their assault troops. You know, when they attacked in March, these were their elite troops they were using. These were their best troops, their first line troops. So they've lost an awful lot of their best troops. So they're making it up with a lot of their other second line troops. They haven't got as much of they're really facing, especially with the Australians and Canadians, they're facing really well disciplined troops, really good fighting troops. The Germans are suffering. They're pretty much a broken army in many ways. They just don't know it yet. The morale is concerned. We do all these trench raids that are going on. They're aware what's happening, and as I said before, the trenches are not in a good state, which is unusual for the Germans. People are quite surprised by that, and they lack that immediate reserves. The Germans have been hemorrhaging manpower at this stage, and what you're starting to see is the build-up of the advantage of the British having more manpower than the Germans, and basically what we start to get is preparations for the battle, and the idea that this has got to be kept really, really secret. So they come up with the keep your mouth shut order. Okay, basically, you fail to keep your mouth shut, it'll be a court-martial straight away. They've basically kept it as the smallest amount of officers as they can. They don't tell the Canadians, the Australians, till about the 31st of July, and then they've got to start planning. This is really, really keeping it as close as possible. They don't really want to tell the French at all. You can't blame them, because this will just go out. They're also looking, what they're trying to do as well, is not give the enemy any idea that they're planning an attack. Okay? So this is one of the key ones. So you'll get the fact that, so the build-up starts 31st of July. They're telling officers to only go in ones or twos to do any recce. They don't want groups of staff officers or groups of officers walking up there and looking on the high ground and being spotted by the Germans. This is the key. They don't want to give them any idea of what they're trying to do, and they want to keep it as low-key as possible. So there's the sort of scale that you're going to see. So in 2 weeks, 4th Army is going from 250,000 men to 450,000 men. Just think of the planning that's going in. You've got to bring all these men in. You've got to bring them up by railroad. You've got to actually bring them and move them around to get them up to these form-up areas and get them ready. Still not really telling anybody what you're going to be doing, because you don't want anyone being captured. The key one as well is they don't want to tell the German artillery what they're about to do, because the Germans, as soon as they get spooked, will move the guns. And this is one of the key things that we're trying to do, is counterbattery fire. So if they move the guns, and we've pre-registered our guns on that, that's part of the, we've lost that initiative. So it's really important. Secrecy is massively important. Planning's there. The problem with road congestion, you're moving that amount of men in a small area, you're going to have an awful lot of road congestion. And that was part of the problem as well. The whole logistics side of it is massive, and you've got to keep this quiet. So you'll have low-flying aircraft, they've done this before. You'll have roads camouflaged with nets, etc. You'll have the whole timetabling of men coming in, etc., movement of men, machine, building up stockpiling, logistics. There's over 7,000 tons of artillery shells being delivered, just for the artillery. It's a huge, huge operation, and they're trying to keep it as quiet as possible. Okay. Okay, so this is just an example of moving the Canadian Corps. 100,000 men at full strength. So the trouble they've got is, once you start moving the Canadians there, they've got a reputation as shock troops. The Germans are going to take notice. So you've got to keep this quiet, move them up slowly, and do it in a way that you're not going to give the game away. You don't want the Germans moving reserves up. That's one of the key bits, because then the element of surprise gone, and the Germans are very good at stopping the momentum going. And that's what you want to keep, this idea of tempo, a high tempo. Keep the Germans off balance. So they're stationed 30 miles to the north at Arras. So you've got to move this whole body of men, 100,000 troops, down towards Amiens and basically get them there in total secrecy. So you can imagine the amount of work and planning that has to go into that. So they're slowly actually going through the staff, getting the staff to understand this, bringing it down, and they start telling the actual units what they're going to be doing. And that starts, they've literally got about a week. So this starts filtering down. So they've also got secrecy deception. So they're basically giving different orders. They're sending different small units out to pretend they're going to other locations, giving them the idea that they're going to attack near Ypres. If you put these over here, so deceive the Germans into thinking where the Canadian Corps is going to be, think that they might hold on to the reserves or might move their reserves in another position. That's what they're trying to do. And that's what's going on. So this whole idea of doing this, and this is not just the Canadian Corps, we're doing that with the Australian Corps. We're trying to give them ideas of what we're doing. Keep it away from the Germans. So, training. There would have been training with the tank units, the brigade units that are going to be with it, but you're limited. What we saw with Hamel was that the units were very good when they trained together. Tanks, artillery, infantry, very good, combined arms. They knew what each other was doing. What we've seen before was as soon as you have troops who don't know or understand what each other's capabilities are, it starts to break down. So it was important to have training. Even if they haven't got the tanks there, they were doing training with men pretending to be tanks. So they'd have them running around and been doing support and going bang, bang, that type of thing. It was really, to give them the idea of what the tanks were going to be doing, which the tanks are going to be going in front of them and they were going to be following. But they knew what the tanks could do. They'd seen them now in operation. Cambrai had been a success in that the tanks had been used properly. Hamel's reinforcing this, so it's all coming in there, and that they realised that basically to be successful you need as many of these arms working in harmony as possible. And so that's what they're trying to do. Integration as much as possible. You won't get as integrated as the artillery. The artillery can be as integrated and come back into the actual divisions, etc. The tanks still remain core units. They're not given over to the actual divisions. They'll support the divisions, but they're not. They're separate. So you don't get that massive, that real sort of integration that you get with artillery level, but they still know what they're doing and they're all matched up. So the artillery. So stockpiles of, as we said, stockpiles of ammunition. Large scales, we get 18 pounders. We've got about 2,000 guns. We're going to have a creeping barrage that's going to run out of sort of 100 yards at a time, moving forward. This is very effective. We've found this to be very effective. Takes a lot of expertise and knowledge, and it allows the, if we've got maps in the museum where we've got the barrage maps, and it actually shows you the lines of each barrage as it's moving forward and all the timings. It's very, it's very effective, and they're doing different types of ammunition. Some are shrapnel to explode in the air, some are HE, etc. They're using all this and stockpiling it, and they're getting it all ready as well. But it's going to be sort of devastating. It's that devastating moment when they start putting these barrages onto the Germans. 2,000 guns, almost half of them 18 pounders. Okay, you've got very large calibers. You'll get the 6 inches, etc. 60 pounders, this type of stuff, and they've allocated 600 rounds per gun. Okay, there is no pre-bombardment. They'll be just doing what they're usually doing in that sector. You want to keep the Germans thinking that everything is tickety-boo and that nothing's going on at all, and that's what they're doing. The key one is the next one, which is counter-battery fire. As we said, they don't want the Germans to have moved. They want those guns to be there because they've located them, and what they want to do is counter-battery fire. And this is what we've been very successful in. So they use sound locators to actually identify where the Germans are. They've used their aircraft, we've spotted them where they are, and we know 95% of where the German gun positions are. So we can do that. So once we open the actual operation up, that first bit is they're going to neutralise those German guns. Yeah, 5 German gun positions. And of course we've got the infantry. But the home of the rifles here. Infantry are very important. The tanks at this stage of their development are still very much a supportive weapon. They're not a decisive weapon, but they are very good at supporting. And so they're here to support the infantry. The infantry has come on leaps and bounds. They're the key fighting troops. Platoons are around 40. We are seeing the use of more automatic weapons like the Lewis gun. We're seeing the use of grenade launchers, with rifle grenades for a more distance high explosive. And then close in, we're looking at the use of Mills bombs, etc. The bags, actually satchel bags full of them, and actually using them. The skill level has come up immeasurably. They're very, very effective. They've shown what they can do. The Australians have been showing what they do. Canadians have been showing what the British have been showing what they can do. These guys know how to fight. They know how to use their firepower effectively, and it's a very effective tactic that they've got going now. Lewis guns down the bottom. What they're doing as well is keeping the tactics simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Get the guys in, train them on how to actually do things, make it easy to learn. And what they're doing as well is relying on infiltration and turning the Germans' flanks. So once you can do that, with the tanks offering fire support, immediate fire support up there, it's really an effective way of getting the British infantry to basically start defeating the German positions. That's the key thing as well. They are trained to cope without tanks there. They will take the infantry's there to take that position. What we see, 3 out of 4 times, if infantry and tanks and artillery are working together, they will take that position. They will take that position really well. If it's just infantry and tanks, it comes down to 25%, 1 in 4 chance. The artillery is really, really important because basically you're suppressing the Germans, and that's really important. And it makes a major impact. And what we've seen before is infantry that have had a really good experience of working with tanks, they actually really like going back into battle with the tanks. Infantry that have had a bad experience say, I don't really want to be too near them. So what you've seen from the Battle of Cambrai onwards is a changing in the mindset. People are beginning to realise that tanks can be really effective. You've just got to understand each other and what the capabilities are. And so that's what's coming up. And the tanks, of course, are a very new weapon, so they're developing their tactics. They're learning on the job as well. They're learning how to deploy them and how to fight with them. So it's an ongoing learning bit. And it's an all-arms team for the BEF. Okay. Tank Corps itself, we've got the Mark 5. So this is at Battle of Cambrai. We had it's all Mark 4s. The Mark 1 to 4 was essentially a very similar tank. It required 4 individuals to drive it. Time we go to the Mark 5, we require 1 driver. Still an 8-man crew, but the 7 other members of the crew are effectively doing the fighting. What we do have here as well, if you can just see up here, at that point, is effectively an armoured box, a cupola for the commander to actually stare up. A lot of the tank commanders didn't like that because they felt they liked to be at the front cap, see where they were going, etc. This does give you the opportunity to look around the battlefield. What the real thing with this is that basically what you're getting is a longer tank. The Germans had since basically March, April of 1917 been extended the width of their trenches because they knew the tanks would fall in. So what the British are doing is extending the length of the tanks. So here we have the Mark V, it's getting longer. Okay, we're able to drive it with one person, it's slightly faster, it's got a better engine, and you've still got this 6-pounder gun, so this is a mail tank, but we can put more machine guns on. It's a more effective tank. One of the downsides to this tank was the fact that the exhaust tended to be coming into the actual tank itself and made it even more unpleasant than it was with the Mark IV. So there's plus and minuses with all this. I've been in our Mark V at the museum when it last moved, and the petrol just grabs you at the back of the throat. It really is because you have to prime it, and it's very pungent. You're aware as well that all the pistons are going up, and you're thinking, that's interesting, because you can see how many digits are going to go at that point. It is, and you're being rattled all over the place, etc. There's no suspension in them at all. You're being thrown around, and you're moving at about 2.5 to 3 miles an hour. That's it, and it rattles around. You're being thrown against heavy bits. So it's an experience before you even go into battle, let alone under fire. So you can imagine that just being in there, and you can't, if you're one of the loaders, etc., actually working in there, you're probably not going to see anything at all. You're just going to be concentrating on making sure the engine's running properly, making sure that tank's moving forward. So, what we also have is the Mark V Star. That's even longer. So basically what they're making it is 6 foot longer than the Mark V. And it weighs 4 more tons effectively. The problem is what's happening is the longer you make the tanks, the harder it is to steer. You've got such a lot of track on the ground that it's very hard to turn it. What you can do though is you can even put men inside there, infantry sections inside. It's getting to that level that there's that much room in it. But this is the whole sort of arms race in terms of the Germans making their trenches wider and us basically making our tanks longer, and the idea being that we don't need to use a fascine. So that's what you've got. It does compromise the driving capabilities of that. So we've got 4th Tank Brigade, 1st, 4th, 5th and 11th Battalions. We've got 5th Tank Brigade, 8th, 13th, 2nd and 15th Tank Battalion. And we've got 10 Battalion, which is a sort of one on its own battalion that's not actually assigned to any of the brigades. And then that's how many you've got in France at that moment. 630 tanks already. You've got 378 Mark Vs, 72 Mark V Star, 84 Mark IVs, which we've got over there, but we're not really wanting to use because we want to move to this newer tank. The 96 mm, that's the Whippet. We'll discuss that shortly. And we've got 16 Austin armoured cars. They're going to be operating in tank battalions. You're going to have 3 companies of tank battalions and 16 tanks per battalion, per company. Normally, and this is where it gets very flexible, is how many you're going to have to a section. It all depends what your objectives are. But that's really what we're getting with the tanks themselves. What else we've got is got the gun carriers units. And these are armed. This is one armed with the 60-pounder. You get some with the 6-inch howitzers. And they are crewed by tank corps units, but the actual guns are crewed by Royal Artillery. And this is effectively allowing you to bring these heavy guns up into the forward line and give more fire support. So part of that idea, they did get hit in a wood around about the 8th of August as well by German artillery. There was they got devastated, to be quite honest. There were quite a lot of shots of these vehicles being knocked out in that area, and people were going by post-war as well. So in late 1918, in early 1919, and showing this graveyard of these gun carriers. But they were assigned to assist, these gun carrier companies, assigned to assist with the fire support for this operation. And what else we have are supply tanks. That's the gun carrier creating the supply tank. You can't have men really bringing up things. You can't really have donkeys. It's not a place for horses, etc. Now, this is a mechanical battlefield, and in order to supply the sheer scale of logistics that you need to have vehicles dedicated to bringing this up. So we have Mark IVs we're doing this, we have the gun carrier tanks. They're bringing up all the oil, all the petrol, all the ammunition in these supply vehicles. So all that's been thought of as well. So, it's very, very effective what they've been doing. Exploitation forces. So we have the Cavalry Corps, 3 divisions. It's not been a good war for the cavalry. It is safe to say. They didn't really do too much at Cambrai, even though there were special contraptions to pull away the grappling hooks, to pull away the wire. They've always been waiting to get to the green fields beyond. They're there again waiting. Okay? It's a very dangerous place for humans and animals. And it's really, the way that the Germans have constructed the Hindenburg system, it's basically designed to go into killing zones. And until you've broken through that, you can't use your cavalry. This is only purely for exploitation. You've got the problem as well is that you have to keep them far enough away so you're not clogging up your frontline troops. And then the problem is, what we've seen at Cambrai before, was that by the time they actually get to the front line, they're so tired because they have to go so far away that they're actually not ready to then actually go into battle. They're too fatigued. So it's very, very interesting where you keep your exploitation forces around. So 3 divisions. What we do get, though, of course, is the Whippet. 96 of these. You've got 2 battalions, and they're going to be there for the exploitation. 3-man crew. It's got, rather than the sort of turret, you've got a fixed superstructure, and it's got ball mounts there, and it will have Lewis machine guns, Hotchkiss machine guns, and basically the idea is effectively to engage the German forces once the big tanks, the heavy tanks, have broken through, and allow these tanks to exploit. It's got 2 engines on it, 1 driving each set of tracks, and this bit here is the front. It's got a very interesting design where that's the front, and that's where the petrol is located as well. It's a very interesting idea, and it made for interesting work on there. The reason why it's used by the exploitation forces is this went at the astonishing speed of 8 miles an hour. Really walking pace at this one. We've seen film as well where you've got a Mark IV moving slowly ahead, and then you've got the Whippet go round it, and you're marvelling at the speed that it's going around. And then just as you're thinking that's really good, they have a horse and cart go around both of them and leave them standing, and it just really puts it into context, just the speed that they're actually moving at. But once they get through these initial German trench systems, they can start causing havoc, and that's what they tend to do. We knew that we needed to build a tank that had more mobility, was faster and lighter. They're not armed with an actual howitzer or a gun. They're armed purely with machine guns, and that's their bit. Basically, it's infantry targets, and they're effectively what they're doing is their mechanical cavalry. So Whippet's 2 battalions. We also have the return of the armoured car to the battlefield. Last seen in the Western Front in late 1914, when we were getting improvised armoured cars all around Ostend, these types of areas. But the problem was the ground, and once the trench systems come in late 1914, early 1915, it was too difficult. Wheels were no good anymore. So what they went to is that they were moved to other theatres of war. What you get, though, is that they know this terrain here it's got good going. It's not cratered too much, and that they can use these armoured cars, and then they can use their speed. So you've got basically a company, 17th Battalion of armoured cars that are going to be used at Amiens. So basically these exploitation forces are going to move ahead of the infantry as past the red line and push on to the final objectives. And they'll tend to hold the position until the infantry arrive. I think the modern sort of idea would be that they're doing almost a paratroop drop ahead, hold the position, wait for the infantry to actually reach them and take over. They are creating disruption and panic. That's what cavalry's supposed to do anyway. Once they get into those rear areas, once you've exploited through, and that's what they're going to do. Royal Air Force, again, you have to bring them in. This is not, this is a modern battlefield. If you compare, you can compare the army of 1918 with the army of World War II, and you'll see a lot of the tactics, you'll see a lot of the actual methods that they're actually using and the techniques that they're actually using in tactics are replicable at that point in World War II. If you look at the army in 1914, it's like from a different age. They haven't advanced so far. And same with air power. Air power, I mean, the first use of tanks in September 1916, we have aircraft above reporting that they can see tanks on the battlefield. They're not surprised, they're actually reporting back to HQ to tell them what's going on. So they're integrated at a level already. It's important to have this. There's 800 aircraft here. So you've got to actually suppress the Germans. They've been doing that already to try and keep them from finding anything out. Then they're going to support, and you've got this large a lot of squadrons for ground attack. And that's probably one of the scariest things is how do you tell when the battlefield is quite fluid who's who? And you're looking at the mud, you're looking at the terrain, and really trying to pick these out must have been really difficult. So it's really vital for the plan as well. It allows that intelligence. They're very crucial for looking at those artillery targets and getting those. And they're targeting the German positions behind as well, aerodromes, bridges, etc., stopping them bringing up their reserves. That's what they want to do. They want to trap their reserves as far away from this battlefield as possible. They want to minimise the amount of reserves that the Germans can move, because that's always stunted the operational success of the British forces. So 0 hour, 4:20 a.m, 8th of August 1918. It is misty. Okay, it is very misty conditions. So what we get is the Australian Corps. So they're going in, and at 07:15 hours, 2nd and 3rd divisions get to the Green Line. So they get to there. By 10:30, they arrive at the Red Line. This is quite considerable distances that they're moving on. This is fast going. And they're really, really pushing the Germans back. The Germans are falling, morale's low, and they're basically, they're taking the positions. And the Australians are doing exactly what they've done at Hamel. They're doing what they've been doing in the trenches. They are, really just performing as you would expect them to perform. And division reaches the Blue Line. This is on the first day. So this is incredible. We're getting out to about almost 10,000 yards, etc. Major gains of ground at this time. And so they're up to the Blue Line. One division, 4th division, is slowed by flanking fire, but really you can look at this as a major success on that day. Overwhelming success. Shock of the bombardment, shock of the attack, and the surprise. They're not expecting this at all. Really, the German resistance crumbles pretty easily, and we're able to take big gains. British 3rd Corps, that's to the north. So there you go, and we get. So their job is to secure the high ground to the north. They're going to move less than the Australians and the Canadians, but it's still very important. It's it's harder ground to attack, and it's easier for the Germans. It's interestingly only given 1 tank battalion. So where the others have got brigades with 4 tank battalions on, almost a battalion to each division, here you've got 1 tank battalion. So effectively providing, splitting up its companies to actually provide support for these units, and that's where you start seeing them slowing down a bit. Without the tank support, it means it's harder going. One of the reasons, though, of course, is it's better to have the tanks in the middle and supporting the Canadian and Australians. The Germans seem to be better here. They're in better defensive positions as well. Generally improves their morale, and so they don't reach all their objectives. And then we have just see that. It was only ever planned, though, as a limited attack. It was never meant to be the main focus of the attack. It's the Canadians and Australians that are the main ones on this. Canadian Corps. So they faced more difficult resistance than the Australians. They got the River Luce in there to the very south. They're going to be coming through that southern area, just the southeast of Amiens, and they're going to basically move. So 1st Division reaches Green Line at 0620, and 2nd Division at 0745. That's from the start at 420. So within 2 hours, they're there at the Green Line. That's it. It's a phenomenal amount of work that they've been doing. Red Line, that's reached by 1230. And they attack along, 3rd Division attacks along the Luce. Secures the high ground and crosses the river. 4th Division takes over and moves forward. It's mainly successful, and they pretty much get up to that blue line. So it's been another successful attack. Okay. Remember, this is not at this stage are they thinking that the Germans are going to crumble completely and this is going to lead on to the war-winning bit. This is the limited operation to do exactly what they're actually, their objectives are, which is push the Germans away from Amiens, and they're achieving it. The French, attack to the south. They're in support. We have to bring them in. We had to tell them what was going on at some point, and they're quite happy getting involved, etc. And they're pushing the Germans back as well. If you move off at 5, it's really diversion to allow to secure the flank and allow the Canadians to basically move on. They advance 5 miles. Again, so the Germans are being hit by the British, they're being hit by the French. There's no real quiet sectors at that point. We've got the cavalry. It's their most successful day of the war. They're able to actually get out. They're actually able to exploit. They're getting to the green fields and beginning to attack. We've got, Whippet units pass through the Australians and Canadians, and they advance the red line. So they're actually passing through units. They're using that speed to get there, and basically they're racing ahead. They're using that capability that you want. You're letting your infantry trying to catch up, but these are racing ahead because once they've gone through those German systems, those trench systems, it's open, fairly good terrain for them. The German trench systems are, you get one large one at the beginning, they'll have a secondary systems further back, and then they'll have another line developing. And that's what you get with this period, is that really what you're trying to do is break through the German systems. They created so many different sort of breakwaters. And what you do with the whole of the 100 days is you're effectively pushing the Germans to the point where they've run out of defensive positions. And so effectively that idea of short-range paratroops, they're holding these positions and waiting till their relief columns are coming up with the infantry. And they are key in keeping that momentum, that high tempo. This is very important. What's happened before is you've got the infantry with the slower tanks pushing on, getting their first, second objective, and maybe stalling on that third objective. What this does with that really good ground is allow the tanks, allow the whippets and the cavalry to get out there and really harass the Germans, stop them actually reforming, because the classic thing with the Germans is to counterattack. And if you can stop them doing that, you can push on. So that's what they're doing, and get that infantry up there to support them. Panic and confusion, and again 17th Battalion coming up with those armoured cars. So there we are, the Black Day of the German Army. So it would be, and that's what it was called. Basically, it was a nightmare for the Germans. They've had to pull back all over the place. It's been, an advantage of up to 8 miles. So that's where the Germans effectively were. The British, Australians and Canadians, and the French. And that's where they are. by the end of the day. You can see that's pretty impressive stuff. About 18,500 captured, 9,000 killed or wounded. So this is large, and as I said, they've advanced up to about 8 miles. So a major impact on the German army, and that's why it was called that Black Day. It's the impact on the morale as well, especially. They're coming up against pretty fresh troops. All these troops have proved themselves before. The Germans are struggling to have that. They don't have those. They've lost their best troops during the early fighting in 1918. They're struggling in comparison. There's a French there as well. And so we get to the 9th, 10th and 11th of August. Diminishing returns. What we've seen before is start running out of steam. These are actually shots of tanks actually moving on the 9th of August. What you see is a massive deterioration in the amount of tanks that are available to be used. They require maintenance. The crews are shattered. 24 hours plus in a tank is very hard going. What we would have is rendezvous points, rallying points to actually basically refit, get the actual tank crews going on. There'd be mechanical breakdowns, etc. That's the problem with these tanks at this time. They're mechanically fairly unreliable, but also the crew fatigue. The start time might be 4:20 in the morning, but they've probably been up the night before as well. So by the time you get to the end of the day on the 9th and you're going into the 10th, the crews are starting to fatigue. You've got the Germans starting to bring up more reserves. They're solidifying their positions, and this is starting to get a bit harder than it was before. And so what you get is so you can see where Amiens is there, and basically what's going to happen is the Germans are going to be pushed back, but not to the same degree. So what we do get is the Canadians have a fresh division that they're trying to push up, but it's held back. They don't push it up, and basically we're able to push forward, but it starts becoming harder and harder. The Germans are making it harder and harder, and you're getting less. I would say you're getting less capabilities going on. So by the 11th of August, there are only 38 tanks that are available to go into action. So you can see that's not the fact they're knocked out, it's just the fact that they require maintenance, they require fresh crews. That tends to be the problem with it. So the results are significant Allied victory, 25,000, 30,000 Germans captured, 400 to 500 guns captured, 4th Army, 22,000 casualties. That's the first day of the Somme. But look what they've got. There's about 4,000 dead in that. For what you're getting, for the area they've captured, it's amazingly well done. And that's why Rawlinson especially deserve a pat on the back, and the Australian, Canadian and the British troops involved all deserve pats on the back for that, because they'd actually, it showed what you could do in that limited amount of time that they planned for it as well. Very short scale of planning, and they'd attacked, and they'd actually shown what they could do against the Germans. And what you get is this rollingness. They just keep up this momentum. And what you get is basically these different punches coming from, one minute it's the French, but it's the British. The Americans are coming up. By September 1918, 20% of the Allied manpower is American. They've come up, so from about June, they're about 3.5%. They've massively increased the numbers in. It's a numbers game that's going against the Germans, and they're being basically knocked off balance all around that front line. It just keeps rolling along. It's that psychological impact as well. That the Germans were really sort of pretty much down on their knees already, and then they lose this major bit of territory, and so even Ludendorff realises they can't win the war. if you look at what the Germans are doing back after Armistice Day, they're having their parades in Germany because they're doing this myth that it wasn't the German army that lost, it was a stab in the back. And so, they're having these parades, and if you looked in these German cities, you see these troops moving through, you think, there they are, they've got the Prussians moving through. It's definitely the stab in the back, it's the Bolsheviks, it's the Jews, it's the politicians, it's not the men at the front, etc. What they've done is historians have closely examined this, and they actually look at it, and they said what you can see is that these regiments that they're sending in, they're tiny fractions of the regiments that actually were fighting, because they're the remaining fragments of these units. They've been destroyed out on these fronts. The German army is little more than sort of been devastated, and this is part of the problem. It's that what's happening is this is really effectively the Germans. The balance has gone. The Allies are in the ascendancies, and the Germans, the morale's there, is just going away. The defensive positions are going to start running out, and realistically, what's happened is that it's all caught up with them from the failure of that operation earlier in the year. They overstretched themselves, and now there's a realisation that basically the Allies have that momentum, and they keep rolling them on and keep pushing them on. So it's that initiative. Allies have the initiative. The Germans just can't steady them. They're trying to move their reserves around, and every time they move the reserves around here, the Allies attack in another position, and they keep them off balance. The Germans just can't solidify that the terrain anymore. So tanks roll in the 100 days. So we have successful combined arms tactics, especially successful when they've trained together. Really makes a difference. The tank yet hasn't reached the levels that we'll see in World War II. It is, it's only been in action for 2 years. It is, it's a technological marvel in many ways, but it has its faults. It's mechanically unreliable. It's very hard to drive. It doesn't have a great range, and it's not that fast. But where it does work well, it is very effective. And so what you've got is this evolution of tactics coming on. What you're also seeing is this is massively damaging to the tank corps as well. This is not, these guys aren't sitting in there and they're coming back and they're having their cup of tea, etc. 44% of the casualties. You're looking at about 7,200 officers and men in the tank corps. 44% is 3,300 odd. That's a lot of casualties. You normally are getting up to 44, 45, almost 50% casualties suffered by the tank corps, and that's having a problem in basically getting the tanks back into action again. You're running it out of crews. So the tanks have been in the forefront. This is not a weapon system that you can sit back and use behind the lines. You've got to it's going to be in that front line, and it's going to be attacking. It's going to be in the van leading the actual troops. So this is by the October period. You've got around 50 tanks that have been basically written off, going to be be knocked out, etc. You've got 300 in repair. So basically, you've got less than half of the tanks that you've got about half the tanks you've started with being able to be deployed to the actual battlefield. It's still seen in that sort of auxiliary weapon. Rather than being decisive, and what we've seen, but that's because of its limitations rather than anything else. If it was capable of doing more, the tactics would reflect that. But the tactics are designed to fit the tank at the time. What you're also getting is at Amiens, on 8th of August to 11th, you're getting the support for one army. So you've got a higher density of tanks. By the time you get to September, October, you're getting 3 armies, and they're having to supply tanks to 3 armies. So the density of tanks is being basically spread out. So it's just they're being effectively handed out to smaller amounts. So each division is going to get smaller amounts of tanks because there's not enough to go around. You're having to give them to 3 armies rather than just the one, and concentrating them. So they're being spread out more. So they're naturally going to have less of an impact than they had at Amiens. this was one of the key things that comes out. Tanks perform best when it's a set piece at this stage. When people know their roles, they're supported by the artillery, and the infantry know what they're doing as well. What happens is that following subsequent days where it starts to go wrong for the tanks, mechanical reliability, crews getting fatigued, but also it's much harder for them to concentrate that force. When it's a set-piece battle, they know their objectives and they can go for them. When they're having to think more on the ad hoc, it's much harder because you don't have that planning going in the same way. Yeah, that's one of the key things. They were, as we said before, they were core assets. They weren't organic, almost like the artillery units weren't integrated as much. So they could be pulled off and repositioned on the battlefield, moved over to another corps, moved over to another support, another division. So they were assets for the corps again, not the divisions. So they get moved around. So you could be fighting one moment, pulled out and moved to another area. You may not know those units at all. So again, lack of integration, lack of cohesion. People know what you're doing. Also, the fact is, as we're pushing more forward, great that it is to be doing that. What's happening as well is that your railheads, obviously the distance from the railhead to the actual front line is taking longer, and so you've got to move these units there. That's all impacting on your logistics. It's all impacting the wear and tear of them. It's taking, basically, a tank battalion will cover 2,000 yards of road at this stage, so it's taking up quite a lot of space. And the Germans are destroying bridges. They're stopping the movement on this terrain, so they're actually trying to slow them down, and this is what's going to happen. So, you don't have tank transporters to this stage. You're either carried by rail or you move under your own steam, and so this is what is happening with the tanks. But 90% of tank attacks made with tanks are successful. That's majorly a plus point for the tanks, because when they start out, they're seen as a little bit unreliable, a bit of a toy, a little bit of a novelty. But now, as I said, 2 years later, 90% of tanks, attacks with tanks are being successful, and it's just showing you how far these tanks have come and the capabilities. As I said before, problem occurs when there's no artillery support. It needs to be combined arms. Once you get the infantry and the tanks together on their own, the Germans can basically push them away and keep them separated, and it becomes much harder for them. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, a bit longer, but I hope that you've enjoyed that.
Yeah. Questions?
You mentioned at the beginning that they didn't want to tell the French. Was security that bad with them?
Security was that bad. They were so worried. When you're reading the material, they really don't want to tell anybody at all until the last moment. So, with the Canadians, they're leaving it to the 31st of July. That's literally 7 days before the actual attack begins. They are very concerned with the French, because once you start telling the French, the rumour will just go out straight away, and they'll lose any sense of security. And that key one is that whole idea that they want to keep the Germans that they've already identified in those positions. They don't want to see those guns move, because then it's complete waste. And that's the whole thing. And you get keep it shut. The words they're using, the strict discipline that they're saying, and the fact that they will take you out and they will court-martial you if you even breathe this. And it's not even being disseminated yet. They're moving the troops. They're not telling the troops what's going to be happening. They're not really telling the officers till about a week before. And slowly it starts to come down. But that idea that you've got the Canadians 30 miles away, up there, and they've not even told them yet. So this idea, because they realise that secrecy is a key thing, and this is another thing from pieces like Hamel, things like Cambrai. Really, if you can keep them quiet and you can actually keep the enemy from knowing what your plans are, you've got that element of surprise. And they knew they could shock them, and that was one of the key things. They definitely shocked the Germans.
So why were the French so bad then?
The French, I just think there was a lot of mistrust by then. You know, by that time you've got the French. That I think that there had been a number, especially where you got the armies meeting. You've got to have good cooperation with them, but you know, you can control your own men by having this, the court martial, etc. You can control it when it's your own army and your own courts. But once you give it to the French, it's not. They're assisting you. They're supporting your flank. It's not their operation. They don't have that same sense of security in the same way. The French are sort of, they'll start telling more of their staff officers, it will filter down. You know, the Germans do have spies in those, in the bordellos and things like that. That will get back. The troops will get back. It will go down and whisper down to the French troops. Trench raids will come in, and suddenly, look, the British are doing that. If you can keep it as tight as possible, then you've got a chance. Giving it to another army, when you've already had misgivings about telling them, because they've happened before, they've had problems with the French before with telling them things, and you might not know for sure that it's the French, but you've got a suspicion. So if you can keep it as close as possible, they're not even telling huge amounts of members of the British Army. They're trying to keep it that quiet, let alone the French. The French are seen as, at this stage, unreliable. You have to run the things through the French, because they're totally, this is their country, but you don't want to tell them the key components of it, and that's the key thing. Don't give them the timings until you have to. Don't tell them what your objective is until you have to.
Sounds a bit like Brexit, really.
Yes, you want to keep your powder dry, really. Who can you trust?
What was it about the Canadians that made them special shock troops?
I think what were you getting? You were getting. Have you met many Canadians? No, we've just had an intern in the museum, John Fisher, 62 years old. Had been in the Canadian Army for about 35 years, and he came over and basically said, I want to work in the museum for three months, free. And he lived at the mess up at Bovington, and unbelievably good. You know, he did everything you asked him to do. He would, and you just this mentality that they had, and that was what they were doing. They again, you see it with Australian Corps. This I think as well. It's that nationalism that they're getting. They're getting the chance to actually prove themselves. There's the conscription that's going on there. You've got some of the volunteers there. But again, it's this chance to basically... They've kept them... What the key thing is keeping them as a corps, not spreading them around. You've got that... they've got a good... they've got a very good general in Curry. He's very advanced in taking on these new ideas about tactics, using... support weapons like the Lewis gun and the grenades, and very, very progressive on this type of thing. He's wants to protect the men as well, and you've got a higher land esprit de corps with them, and it comes through in their actions. They're fighting as Canadians. They're part of the British Empire, but they're fighting as Canadians for Canada, and just the pride. Again, you just see the pride of being Canadian. We're not American, we're Canadian, and it's like and they love the connections with the British, but they are very proud of what they're doing, and they were just I think again they're fighting for each other, and that's what you're getting as well. And they'd learnt how to fight. If you start looking at some of the best infantry units in the British Army are the Canadians and the Australians, and they just seem to excel on that
Not
small
French
unit.
Canadians. John.
What communication system? There are a lot of aircraft. What communication systems do the aircraft have? Do they have to talk to the ground for their... That's a very good task.
Yes. So now my knowledge of the aircraft is less, but we have, so I know from September, October of 1916, the observer would be basically having a little log card, and we've seen that him logging down what's going on below him. Then they're reporting back down to the aerodrome. What you do have is you do have those observation balloons. Now they have the ability to actually get the telephone down and transmit it straight down to the ground as well. So you have that bit. They'd have done so much reconnaissance. They'll have had that whole area basically plotted. They'd have been flying over, reporting back first thing, coming back in. So whilst they're not getting instant communication, you're seeing it in a very short period of time. So a matter of hours, they're actually reporting back. So they're getting so HQ is getting a very sort of they're getting the reports coming back. They still have to fly back. We've seen that with the tanks as well. What they can't seem to do at the moment is have an aerial or transmit back while you're moving. This is taking time to do that, and at this stage everything tends to have to be static. So with the aircraft, they're basically going to fly up, observe and come back. There won't be that radio communication at this level.
So as one at the back, John, can I just go on?
I just
Wait.
wanted to do something connected with that.
Oh, okay, sorry, go on. Yeah.
What was I going to say? Were the German planes not doing it in the opposite direction?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, what they've tried to do is they've brought so many squadrons in, the British, and so many planes, 800. They've tried to suppress the Germans and try and keep them as grounded as much as possible. They're attacking. They've got bombers attacking the aerodromes. They're trying to basically nullify the German aircraft, keep them down, because if the German aircraft are allowed to have free rein, they will spot what's going on. So yeah, that's the key thing. And
some of them not get through.
yeah, basically, we were so good at suppressing the Germans at this stage. That whole capability of basically just massing that amount of aircraft, those squadrons, has effectively overwhelmed the Germans on that part of the battlefield. They are, again, they've got the French, they've got the Americans. They're under, what you would be doing as well is you'd be putting them under pressure on other parts of the battlefield. So at that stage, they're not aware that there's this big build-up because they're being held in check. Yeah.
Well, it's a classic thing of getting air superiority.
Yes.
John. Yeah.
For most of the First World War, command was exercised with landline and runners.
Yes.
Once we started to move like this, what improved command and control?
Well, we do get. I was talking about the. If you saw the Mark V tank, you would have noticed that they'd started to develop, especially for the Canadians. They had these. They had basically above the top of the tank. They had basically a metal shaft and a disc, and it had these arms, and you could effectively do semaphores.
So semaphore.
Yeah. So they were doing that with tanks, and there were around about 50 different combinations that they could say. Okay, so you're still going to have that fact that once they start moving into those objectives, getting that immediate information back to HQ is really going to be still quite difficult. In the immediate area, you can connect with the actual troops around you. Getting the message back is still going to be really done by carrier pigeon, and it's going to be done by runner. That's really what you're going to be doing, and the aircraft above. The aircraft can still fly over, see what's going on, and come back and deliver that message in that same time. But you're looking at there is a few hours delay, and the problem that HQs have got as well is how do they actually then change things if the actual troops are in action? There's the delay in getting the message to them, and then the delay in them getting another message back forward, another order to actually improve it. The guys generally, what they'll have is, we've seen it with Combray before, is what they'll have is they'll have those three objectives, and they'll know where their rally points are, and that's why the tanks were really good in those set piece ones. They knew what they were doing. It starts to go to pot because of the lack of communications once they move away from that set piece. Once you start pushing them to areas where they haven't recce'd it, they don't know their orders, and they don't know where they're going to rendezvous, that's when it starts going, because they just don't have that fast enough communications to be able to actually change and adapt in the same way.
So the basis really was they have set orders.
Yeah, but effectively that's why you see them being really effective when it is set attacks, but they start struggling when they move beyond that.
Got time for one more.
Played down the role of the tank as a key weapon. So do you see its benefit as being kind of mobile artillery support to the infantry, or do you see it as being armoured territorial possession? They could get forward and hold ground, but they were protected, whereas the infantry were not protected.
It's effectively, when it's first designed, it's designed to go out, crush the wire, and suppress especially the German positions, the machine gun positions. So it was always seen as a secondary weapon, as a support weapon at this stage. It's just what you do get is you get the ones that are actually staying up there providing support. And you'll see there's many examples of tanks that are left on the battlefield and are basically defending themselves for 24 hours, being a real nuisance, firing their guns, etc., and really being up there. But that's not their main job. I mean, a lot of the men were told as well that basically, if you get ditched, take the Lewis guns out, spike your guns, and come back. You're more valuable than the tank. So that tended to be the thing, that they wanted to bring the men back in, keep these really highly trained men and get them back in. Same with the RAF. You are joining in an elite at this time. You're going into new weapons. Same with the tank corps. This is an elite. This is a new weapon system. So they want to maintain these guys. These guys are normally going to be quite technically minded as well. But when you get them up there, yes, it's basically to support the infantry. That's their job. They can't really. You see the odd occasion where tanks can move off on their own, and they'll just, they'll basically go along and attack the German positions on their own, etc., and maybe come back. But generally, they're there to support the infantry. And as we said, it's that set piece bit. Support them. Once you get them away from each other, that's when they're vulnerable. When the infantry are on their own and the tanks are on their own, that's when they're vulnerable and they can be broken apart. So generally you want to keep them very close to each other and mutual support.
It's a good place to stop, because there's a good smile on the faces of our Royal Tank Regiment when you started talking about an elite force. They cheered up. Fascinating, a long way from Blackadder when you think about it, and the first sort of the start of the all arms battle, which of course is the cry. And just think how the Germans must have learned from it and progressed when you look to what happened in 1940 in France. Is Amiens a Royal Tank Regiment battle? I don't know.
It is.
It is, yes.
It is.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I display my ignorance. But Stuart, thank you very much indeed. That was fascinating, and you covered a huge amount of ground in a great deal of detail.